Okay, so the class, Mm. so the class is being recorded, and good evening, everyone. And this is A230A Summer, and we're starting um, a new phase or a new stage in the course. We're talking about the Romantics. We are done with the Elizabethan and the Jacobean ages, and we did a number of representative plays, and we also finished the 18th century with Candide, and now we're moving to the 19th century, late 18th century and early 19th century. We're doing poetry this time around. Last time it was narrative, novella. When I say narrative, I mean novels, short stories, and novellas, because there is a narrator and there is a narrative. And prior to the novella, Candide, we did plays, drama. So this time around, we're doing poetry, and poetry is kind of unique. Of all the other genres, it is the most musical, and it requires talent, just like the other genres. They also require a talent. Um, So my first question to you is, you've been doing poetry for quite some time. You've been, perhaps this is part of our life. We're exposed to poetry in our native tongues. We may be poets ourselves. Yeah, right. So do you like poetry, regardless of the language? Regardless of the language. Do you like poetry? Hmm. You like poetry. Okay. Only one person likes poetry. You know what poetry is in Arabic? شعر, الشعر. Do you like الشعر? معقولة? Only one person likes poetry.
Can I say something about poetry?
Yeah, say something about poetry.
I like poetry يعني from years and years ago, and I feel the words is the most beautiful thing that you can see all the ages uh, when you read the poetry. That's it.
You mean it reflects a lot of things. It reflects the mood of the speaker. It can reflect the age, right? Can reflect so many things. Yeah, it's very beautiful, very musical, like I said. Okay, so what kind of poetry do you said that you write poetry, Munira, right?
No, I didn't write poetry. I
You
just
don't.
read another
You,
thing like prose.
yeah, you mean
Nothing.
you appreciate poetry. You know when you know a good poem when you see one, when you hear one, right? So
Yes.
you're into poetry as a listener and as a reader, right?
Yes.
Arabic and English poetry, both.
Both.
Arabic,
I
both.
like
No.
beautiful words where
Hmm.
which
Yeah,
languages.
yeah, whether it's English or Arabic or any other language for that matter. That's interesting. Other people, if you don't have to be a poet, and I'm not asking if you're a poet. I'm asking if you appreciate poetry, if you if you catch yourself listening to a poem or a poet, if you read poetry sometimes. Again, irrespective of the language. It can be English, can be Arabic, can be Urdu if you speak Urdu. Mm. So let's make a talent inventory. Let's make an inventory of the talents that we have in class. Talents are things that you are gifted with. It can be painting, it can be doing stuff with your own hand, it can be sculpting, it can be reciting Quran, it can be writing poetry, can be writing in general, writing novels, short stories. So can be public speaking. So let's make an inventory of the talents that we have in class. So if you have a talent, raise your hand. It can be singing, no talents in class. يا جماعة. Yeah, I just want to make sure that you guys can hear me. If you can hear me, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay, good. I'll ask the question again. If you're talented in anything, just come to the mic and share your talent with us. Okay? Those who would like to share their talents with us, raise your hands. You know what a talent? Talent يعني موهبة. If you have a موهبة, come to the mic and share it with us. Don't deny us this. Okay. طيب. Okay. So we don't have to appreciate poetry. We don't have to be poets, but at least we can recognize a poem when we see one. We can say that this is a poem when we see one. So, what makes a poem different from a non poem, if you like? How can you tell that this is a poem, not a short story, not a novel, not a play?
I think, Doctor, when they say the rhyme and the words, we can know this poetry or no. I think this is my opinion.
Rhyme, rhyme. Okay,
Yeah,
so
right.
the rhyme, which is the music at the end of the line or the lines, right? When you have two words rhyming together, having the same ending with the same sound at the end. This is called rhyme and it's highly musical. Yeah, this is something that we don't have in a novel, in a short story, right? You can have it in a play if it's a verse drama, if it's a play written in poetry or in verse, like in the past. Okay, so this is one of the things that distinguish poetry from non-poetry. The fact that poetry rhymes, there is a rhyme. What else? Anyone and everyone. What makes a poem distinguishable from other forms and from other genres?
For me, I think the words and how they describe their feelings is the most important thing.
Well, words are common among all the genres. Plays are also written in words. Novels are also written in words. Short stories are written in words,
But
right?
the way they describe their feelings, that's matter for me.
Well, you can describe your feeling in any other. This is not very distinguished. This is not what makes poetry different. Spoke about rhyme or music at the end of lines. We also have what we call meter and rhythm, the tempo, the beat. Okay, this is also music and it's internal music. What else? In terms of length, are poems long, very long? Can they be as long as novels? Not really, unless we're talking about epic poetry. Epic poetry can be hundreds of lines, but we don't write epic poetry anymore. Shar al-Malhami, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. We don't write epic poetry anymore. So poetry and poems, for the most part, are short, however long they are. They can be 14 lines to make a sonnet. They can be bigger than that, longer than that, or shorter than that, but they wouldn't amount to much in terms of length. Again, you cannot compare them to a novel. A novel can be hundreds of pages long. So length, poems, however long they are short. So where do you see a poem on the page? In terms of margins, you see poems from one margin to the other, like you see in a novel or a short story. Are the lines of a poem very long from margin to margin? The answer is no. No. You can also recognize a poem from where it is on the page. It is normally in the middle of the page, okay, not moving from one margin to another like we see in novels and short stories, right? Poetry also addresses our different senses, our sense of hearing, our sense of seeing, our sense of feeling, touching. So these are um, kind of accentuated, and I wouldn't say exaggerated in poems. There is this stress on engaging our different senses, seeing where you normally have colors, different colors and different shapes, hearing when you have, for example, rivers making certain sounds, birds singing in a certain way, wind making certain kinds of sounds, animals making certain sounds. So poetry engages our senses to the extent that when you read poetry, you would feel that you are in front of a painting, but this painting is not made with paintbrush. It is made with and of words. So it's a verbal painting. لوحة لفظية، لوحة مصنوعة من الكلمات وليس من الألوان. Okay? So this this is what distinguishes poetry from non-poetry. Again, the idea of length, the fact that poetry, however long, is not as long as other genres, especially the novel. In terms of um, horizontal space, they don't move from one margin to another, and they have their music, whether it is at the end of the lines with rhymes. They have their internal music when we talk about the rhythm or the meter or the tempo of the poem. They have imagery, um, and they address our different senses. So when you put all of this together, you have poetry. And again, poetry is about conciseness and compactness. I cannot think of any other genre that is as compact and as concise. Poetry is short and sweet. So, whatever a novelist can say in hundreds of pages, a poet can say in a couple of lines or in 6 or 7 or 8 lines. So, poetry is about compactness and conciseness. Poetry is very condensed, and also poetry is about manipulating the language. With poetry, you don't see this normal subject, verb, rest of the sentence structure that you're so used to in English. Sometimes you have fronting where perhaps the verb is fronted. Sometimes you have the subject put at the end for for a specific effect. All is working towards achieving a desired effect. Poetry, because of this manipulation of the language, is up for grabs in terms of meaning. Meaning in poetry can be varied and diverse to the extent that they say that poetry is, for the most part, philosophical and the most intellectual of the literary genres. So it takes calculation. You don't read a poem the way you read an article in a newspaper. Poetry needs you to be um, agile, very active, very alert, needs you to be very knowledgeable about the world, about world views. You cannot approach a poem with an empty head or an empty mind. In order for you to appreciate a poem and to unlock its secrets, you have to be poetry savvy, if you like. You're into poetry, You know what happens with poetry. You're able to dissect it to its basic components, you know, and you recognize sounds when you see ones. You recognize imagery. You tune in to the music and you can identify and detect it in a poem. So again, reading poetry and listening to poetry is a fun experience and a pleasing experience. It is true, but it is also very daunting sometimes. It can be challenging if you don't have the right tools, mental, emotional tools, if you don't have the aptitude and the readiness to read poetry, because poetry, let's face it, is not for everyone. And that wouldn't make you less if you don't appreciate poetry or read poetry. That's fine because you may be good at something else. But those who like poetry, whether because they write poetry or perhaps because they appreciate poetry, know how to negotiate their ways through in poetry, in poems. So I'll ask you again, because when I asked you, you were just coming and perhaps you didn't hear me well enough. I'm asking if you guys, if we have any poetic talent in class. Do we have people who write poetry? Again, the language is irrelevant. It can be Arabic, English, Urdu, whatever the language is. Hmm. Okay. So my second question is whether you appreciate poetry. You catch yourself listening to a poet or a poem. You appreciate it, you like it, you get affected by lines because perhaps they are philosophical, perhaps they are wise, nuggets of wisdom. معقولة. You don't have a favorite poet? No favorite poets? A poet is a شاعر or شاعرة.
Yeah, I think I have lectures.
Mm. Tell
في
us.
بدر بن عبد المحسن الله يرحمه.
Yes, Allah yarhamu. Yeah, a great and a very
Yes,
beautiful
yeah.
poet. Yes, absolutely. Any other poets? Any other favorite? Anyone and everyone? Okay. Okay. So again, we're talking about poetry and we're going to talk more about how to read a poem. And when you read a poem, and by reading, of course, is engaging with the poem, you engage with the poem for multiple reasons. It can be because you appreciate poetry. It can be because you work as a literary critic and you're supposed to critique a poem. It can be for exam purposes. You have a poem and you're supposed to dissect it. You're supposed to show how good, or for that matter, bad the poem is. So when people approach poetry in order to analyze them, in order to talk about their merits and to see it, in order to critique them, they approach poetry in two different ways. They approach poetry thematically, where they focus on the topic or the theme of the poem. They ignore anything and everything else. They look at the poem, they read the whole poem, and they tell you this poem is about war. This poem is about love. This poem is about revenge. So this is what we call thematic or textual poetry, where the focus is on the text. Another approach would be what we call the formal approach. And formal comes from the word form, شكل, where you focus on the uh, poem, where you focus on the form of the poem. And the form of the poem translates into rhyme and rhythm, imagery, um, length, um, how big or small, how long or short a poem is. So these are formal aspects. So you either approach a poem in a thematic textual way where the focus is on the main idea, on what the poem says. And the other approach would be to focus on the formal aspects of the poem. How the poem communicates the ideas. And it's about with the formal approach, we focus on the how. With the thematic approach, we focus on the what. So poetry captures our mood, conveys feelings, and communicates a message by using rhythm, sound, and imagery. And poets normally use different techniques to convey the meaning or the sense of a poem. What are those techniques? They choose a speaker, the persona of a poem, who is not necessarily the poet himself. And then they use diction, and diction means vocabulary, certain vocab items, words that you're not likely to see anywhere else. You only see in poetry. Sound, right? Like I said, when we talk about rhyme and rhythm, imagery, like I said, you end up having a verbal painting where poetry engages the different senses, sense of feeling, touch, seeing, hearing, right? And then figurative language when you liken things to each other, when you compare things, when you engage in metaphor making. Okay, so these are all formal aspects. These are all techniques, and you use them in order to communicate meaning. And these are brief definitions of each and every aspect of a poem. Remember what we said about speakers. You're having a speaker who can be the poet himself or a character or a thing. Talk about sound, and by sound, of course, we mean the rhyme at the end of the lines, the rhythm, uh, um, and the horizontal space that we have. We have alliteration where we're talking about the first sounds of a number of lines, successive words having the same sound, or assonance where you have whatever is common among two or three words is in the middle, and it's normally the vowel. And onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is a word whose sound indicates and suggests its meaning. Like I said, you have images that appeal to one or more of the senses. And figurative language, when we talk about metaphors, similes, and personifications. And of course, like we said, dictions are specialized language that is exclusive to poetry. And these are all definitions. When we talk about sound, in a poem, we talk about alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, rhyme, and rhythm. Again, alliteration is a poetic or a literary effect achieved by using several words that begin with the same or similar consonants. When I say, for example, whither wilt thou wander, wayfarer? Assonance, which means the similarity of two or more vowel sounds. An onomatopoeia, like I said, is the formation or use of words that imitate the sound associated with something. When I say that, hissing and buzzing, can almost tell what hissing refers to and to which animal. When you talk about hissing, we talk about snakes. Buzzing. The word, the sound suggests the meaning. And then we have rhyme as part of the sound structure of a poem, which is a similarity in the sound of word endings. And rhythm, which is the pattern formed by stressed and unstressed syllables. When we talk about poetry, we also, and we talk about the formal aspects, we talk about figurative language, talk about metaphors and personifications and analogies. Metaphors, when you describe something or somebody using a word or a phrase that is not meant in a literal way. We use for that vivid comparisons that express something about, people. When I say, for example, that somebody is a lamb, so I am comparing him to a lamb, and obviously there is a meaning behind that. And I'm trying to say that is he or she is as innocent as a lamb, very meek, very beautiful, very kind, all those nice things. Simile also goes under figurative language. So it's a figure of speech that draws a comparison between two different things using words like or as. When I say white as a sheet. And then we have personification under figurative language, which is the attribution of human qualities to objects or abstract notions. And I said, this city now does like a garment wear. So I'm obviously personifying the city, giving it human attributes and qualities. Um, and I'm saying that it is like a human being that is wearing a garment. This is all formal and it focuses on the form of the poem. Again, that wouldn't be obviously the end of it. You need to also read through the poem in order to understand its meaning. So a full understanding and a full subsequent appreciation of a poem does not happen unless you engage with its formal aspects. The formal aspects of a poem can allow you to delve deep into its meaning and unlock its secrets in terms of what the writer or the poet is trying to get across to us. So this is what poetry is all about. And so this is what you need to do every time you have a poem. You need to engage with the poem on two different levels, on the formal level and also on the thematic or textual level. Okay, so the poetry that we're doing is the poetry of the Romantics. And before we do the poetry of the Romantics, I would like to ask if you have done any poetry before from your experience. You've been with us for quite some time now. Did you do poetry before, whether you did it here or perhaps in your high school years? Hmm. Have you ever done poetry before? Done means that it was explained to you, and then you went um, to do exams in poetry as part of your academic efforts to move from perhaps one grade to another. Have you done poetry before in your school years? The answer is no. Even in Arabic, because I know my school years are like way back, but I still vividly remember that we used to have poems as part of it was Arabic, so we used to have Arabic qasaid. You didn't do qasaid back at school? في ايه يا جماعة؟
Yes, we take many poetry in Arabic, and it's also from Al Jahiliyyah. We study all the, not all of them, but some poet from Al Jahiliyyah. I think I remember Zuhair Abi Sulma and many of them.
Yeah, Nabi Zubiani, lots of very beautiful pre-Islamic poets. Al-Khansa, lots of, I mean, even women poets, and they were very famous. Anyway,
Also, Antar bin Shaddad.
yeah, Antara, yes, he was a great poet and a great warrior too, yes. Um, so this is poetry, and poetry comes in different shapes and forms. Again, can be written in um, long lines, very, very long lines, talking about battles and wars and heroism. And this is what we call epic poetry, Shar al-Malhami. And it can be short, can be like sonnets, poems that have 14 lines. It can be between this and that. Can be an ode, like we're going to see ode to the west wind, ode to a nightingale, ode to a skylark. Um, Again, the poetry that we're doing is the poetry of the early 19th century, the English poetry of the early 19th century, late 18th century, and early 19th century. And this time period is known um, as the Romantic period. And I don't want us to misuse the word romantic. By romantic here, I don't mean people falling in love with each other and getting married and living happily ever after. No, by romantic here, I don't mean romance. I mean this kind of poetry, this kind of movement that was prevalent and widespread in the late 18th century and early 19th century. It was a group of poets who started a movement, and they started to revolutionize poetry, to write poetry that is different from the poetry of the people before them. Why do they want to change poetry? Because they believe that poetry was not expressive enough, that poetry was not free enough, that the poet wasn't free enough to manipulate the language, to experiment with the language, to come up with something different. So the Romantics, um, and when I say the Romantics, I don't only mean um, the poets. I also mean sculptors. I also mean philosophers. I also mean novelists who wrote and made things and made arts with this spirit of, um, you know, revolution in them. They wanted to effect changes to the way poetry and the other artistic forms were made. They believed that poetry and the other forms were so stagnant, and the existing poets and the poets before them were so set in their old ways. They were rigid, and you wouldn't expect good poetry and good art uh, when there is rigidity. Poets are free spirits, and they want to exercise this freedom in their poetry. And they do that whether in the form of the poem, in the rhyme schemes, in the rhythms, in how varied the poem is in terms of length, in terms of its horizontal space. So romantic poetry is very free, free from the rigidity of old or older poetry, the poetry of the Augustan age, for example, in the 18th century and 17th century. They wanted poetry that is free of all those restrictions. So this is as form as far as form is concerned. Again, when they came to the ideas, they started to talk about ideas that the previous and the old poets never uh, cared to talk about. Ideas that older poets and traditional poets wouldn't consider good poetry or good for poetry. The Romantics, and we're going to perhaps focus more on Romantic poets, focused on nature. They lived, they wanted to be close to nature. And by nature, we don't mean the gardens, the well tended and trimmed gardens that we see around in the city. By nature, they meant the countryside, where you have mountains, where you have rivers, you have birds singing and moving freely and flying, where you have animals left to their own devices. So, this is the nature that the Romantics had in mind. It's the nature of the countryside, the nature of the jungle and the forest, not the nature of the garden, the well-tended garden. So, um, again, their poetry was also, and perhaps for the first time, was about feelings and emotions. Obviously, feelings and emotions before them were taboos. The poet shouldn't express his or her feelings. The poet should be like a mirror reflecting reality, reality as is. So the poet and the poem is a mirror. The poet is holding a mirror to life, to reality. So when you have a mirror, it reflects the objects as is. So this is what a poet should be according to the pre-romantic poets and conventions. So obviously the romantics, when they came, they said, no, this is not the right thing. We should be engaging with nature, and we also should express feelings and emotions, whether those feelings are ours or the feelings of others. So the Romantics also celebrated what is strange, what is perhaps occult, what is not ordinary, the extraordinary, because for the longest time, poets before them were engaged in discipline, in harmony, in symmetry. So when the Romantics came, they said, enough is enough. We have been trained to only talk about whatever is organized, whatever is trimmed, whatever is perceived as harmonious. But where? Where did we go with this? We still have wars, we still have people fighting with each other. Obviously, poetry with the symmetry and harmony and organization and decorum didn't educate people. It made them who they are. Perhaps if we try something else more revolutionary, like celebrating nature, wild nature, celebrating what is strange, celebrating what is not perceived as harmony and harmonious, this can kind of stir something in people, and it can make them move and do creative things. They also engage with the imagination. And of course, with the imagination, you set your different imaginative, imaginary faculties free. You come up with strange connections. You see life in a different way, not in a monotonous, organized, drab way. So these were the Romantics with their revolutionary ideas and their revolutionary techniques and ways of seeing things. Again, they see things in a different way. So, Romanticism is an attitude, it's an intellectual orientation that characterized many works of literature, painting, music, architecture, criticism, and historiography in Western civilization over a period from the late 18th century to the mid 19th century. Yeah. So Romanticism can be seen as a rejection of the principles of order, calm, harmony, balance, idealization, and rationality. It was a reaction against the Enlightenment and against 18th century rationalism and physical materialism in general. What the Romantics focused on and emphasized was the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. Okay, so when we talk about the Romantics and their features and characteristics, we're talking about a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, a general exaltation of emotion over reason and of the senses over the intellect, a turning back to the self, and a heightened examination of human personality, its moods, and mental potentialities. It has this preoccupation with the genius, the hero, and the exceptional figure in general, and a focus on the passions and the inner struggles of the genius and the hero and the exceptional figure. Again, they have this new view of the artist as a supremely individual creator whose creative spirit is more important than strict adherence to formal rules and traditional procedures. They also emphasize uh, um, the importance of the imagination as a gateway to transcendent experience and spiritual truth. They thrive in and on folk culture, national and ethnic cultural origins, and the medieval period. They have this predilection for the exotic, the remote, the mysterious, the weird, the occult, the monstrous, the diseased, and even the satanic. Um, Again, when we talk about the Romantics, we talk about the 1790s with the publication of the lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So it was a preface, and it was a preface to the second edition, which inaugurated the Romantic movement in poetry. And in the lyrical ballads, they describe poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This became the manifesto of the English Romantic movement in poetry. Together with William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, we also have William Blake, who was the third principal poet of the movement. Some people may consider him a pre-romantic poet because he came before them. Romantic poetry is divided into two waves. You have the first wave or the first phase where you have romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge and even William Blake. And then you have a second wave or a second phase or a second generation where you have poets like John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron. And this is the Romantics. And now we're going to move to a representative poet, namely Wordsworth. But before we do that, I'll give you a 10-minute break. So we're meeting in 10 minutes, inshallah. Yalla, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we're back. Are you guys back? Raise your hands. Okay. So it's the romantics that we're talking about. It's romantic poetry, to be more specific. And I gave you some kind of introduction about what poetry is. And we started to talk about the different types of poetry. And we spoke about poetry before the romantics and poetry with the romantics. And obviously, and like we said, the romantics came as a reaction to traditional poetry formations, traditional poetry rigidity, if you like. They started to chart in their own ways. Their poetry is free of the rigidity and the restrictions of older poetry. Whether we're talking about themes and ideas or forms um, um, and poetics. Uh, we said that the romantics, in terms of generations, are divided into two generations. You have the first romantic uh, mm, poetry, first generation romantic poetry, uh, pioneered by people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, and pre-romantic like William Blake. And you have second generation romantic poetry, the second stage of romantic poetry, where the focus is obviously not entirely on nature like it used to be. Second generation romantic poetry, we have people like Lord Byron, people like Shelley, and others. Now we're going to take a representative poet, romantic poet, and the kind of poetry and the kind of themes and ideas that romantic poetry promoted. So again, it's Wordsworth that we're talking about. And the title of the chapter is William Wordsworth, Poet in the Landscape. Just give me a second. Again, we're talking about the Romantics, and we're talking about a representative Romantic poet who is William Wordsworth. And um this corresponds to a chapter that you have in the book called William Wordsworth, Poet in a Landscape. So William Wordsworth, like we said, is a first generation Romantic poet, one of the pioneers of English Romantic poetry. He is commonly known as the poet of nature. Poet, we know. In a landscape, of course, landscape is obviously a reference to what his poetry is about, which is about landscape, which is about nature. Again, it's outside nature, like we agreed. Um, we need to also, in order for us to fully appreciate Romantic poetry and to also appreciate uh, one of the pioneers of Romantic poetry, we need to read perhaps more about the biography of Wordsworth. Wordsworth was a city poet like any other poet. He was born and raised in the city. But somehow, and because of what was happening, the advent of the Industrial Revolution and um, the massive unemployment that it caused and left behind, the the enormous amount of poverty that it caused was felt um, kind of disenchanted with what was happening. He wasn't happy. And he, along with a number of other poets, started Romantic poetry. Of course, to talk about this idea of going back to nature, because the Industrial Revolution, when it came, it started to focus on the city, started uh, um, to even attract people from the countryside to go and work in factories. So obviously, Wordsworth and others were all against that. In order to also kind of practice what he preaches about the countryside, he moved to the countryside at one point in his life. He left the city behind and lived in the countryside in what is now known as the Duff Cottage. So the Lake District in Cottage became entrenched within the popular imagination when Wordsworth was still alive. And even after his death, Dove Cottage became a museum in 1890. So Dove Cottage and the surrounding landscape are still conceived or perceived rather as places where you can get closer to the poetry through getting closer to the poet's life. So this is where Wordsworth used to live. As you can see, it's outside nature, the nature of the countryside. It's untouched and unmolested by um, city dwellers, by human beings. And you can expect what kind of poetry will come out of that. It's going to be pure, free, free of restrictions and limitations. Again, we spoke about that. And we spoke about reading a poem, we spoke about its formal aspects. I'm not going to repeat that. And the poem that we're doing is, for Wordsworth, of course, is I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud or the Daffodils. So what I want you to do now is I would like you to read the poem And you don't have to understand every single thing. I mean, get an overall impression of the poem, feel the poem, and then come back and tell me what you think it communicates and what kind of feelings you have reading the poem. Yalla, I'll give you 4 minutes. Yalla, go ahead, read the poem. You have it in front of your eyes. Yalla. By the way, you don't have to understand every single word, but just read. Okay, so let's talk about it. Whatever you understood, everyone, and okay, come to the mic and share. We're not taxing, we're not judging. What did you understand, if any? Okay. I don't know whether you guys are tired or I don't know what's happening to you today. You're not yourself. Anyway, I'll stop on this note and with this item. So I want you to go and read the poem on your own and come up with as many ideas as you possibly can. And we'll talk more about it tomorrow, not tomorrow. We're going to meet again this week on Wednesday at 6 o'clock for the makeup class. Remember, we missed yesterday's or last night's class. So I'm making it up to you on Wednesday, inshallah, at 6 o'clock. Is that fine with everyone? Yes. So we're meeting this week again on Wednesday at 6 p.m. When you come, I would like you to read this poem and other Wordsworthian poems. Get to know the man, what kind of poetry he writes, and we'll talk about all of that, inshallah, when we meet on Wednesday. Do you have any questions before we call it a night? I'll give you the marks, the MTA marks on Wednesday, inshallah, when we meet. Yalla, I'll see you, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bye bye.